I was 17 when my parents finally started building their first greenhouse. It wasn't anything special, just a simple structure with fogged up plastic walls, but it was enough to grow fresh herbs, vegetables, and even a few fruit trees. I had my own little shelf of plants, ones I was obsessed with: Dusty Millers, purple white pansies, a couple of succulents, and a mimicry plant that looked like a strange gnarled horseshoe. The greenhouse sat just 10 feet from the tree line, right where our yard met the dense Appalachian woods. I grew up hearing stories about those woods, ones my parents brushed off as old folklore, but ones I took seriously. Strange things happened out here, and I knew better than to wander too deep alone. Whenever I had to be outside for long, I brought my dogs with me. War, my biggest dog, always wore a GPS tracking collar because he had a nasty habit of disappearing for hours. That collar was the only thing that kept us from losing him completely. It was an early spring evening, the sky a muted orange as the sun dipped toward the horizon. I was alone in the greenhouse, carefully watering my plants, while the dogs lounged closer to the house. The air smelled fresh, damp from an earlier rain, and everything was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Then I heard it. A crack in the woods. I froze, holding my breath, ears straining. The sound hadn't come from my dogs nor from my parents. There was no one else outside. It could have been a deer or some other animal, but something about it felt too close, too deliberate. Then it started. A noise unlike anything I had ever heard. It sounded like a horse trying to mimic a child's laughter. High-pitched, scratchy, and wrong. The sound looped, repeating in a way that no living thing should have been able to. My blood ran cold. The air inside the greenhouse suddenly felt suffocating. Every part of me screamed to run, but I knew better than to show fear. I forced myself to move naturally, to act as if I hadn't heard a thing. I finished watering the plant in front of me, pretended to check the others, and slowly put everything back in its place. My shadow stretched long against the fogged plastic walls, distorting my movements into eerie shapes. If something was watching, all it would see was a dark outline. I turned to the greenhouse door, stepping out as casually as I could. The moment I locked it behind me, I made my way up the hill toward the house, my pace steady but never hurried. Every hair on my body stood on end. The laughter still echoed behind me, twisting through the trees, growing fainter yet no less disturbing. Then War noticed me. I heard his paws crunch the dry grass as he started walking toward me, his head tilted as if sensing something was off. I opened my mouth to call him, but before I could, he froze, ears flattened, muscles tensed. Then, without warning, he bolted. I had never seen him move like that before, snarling like a wild animal as he charged past me and straight into the trees. I had no time to react. 1 second he was there, the next he was gone, swallowed whole by the woods. The laughter stopped. Silence stretched around me, thick and unnatural. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the spot where War had disappeared. I didn't dare follow. The woods were too vast, too dangerous in the fading light. My parents helped search for him, but he was just gone. 6 days passed. I barely slept, dreading the thought that whatever had lured him into the trees had taken him for good. But on the seventh morning, War came back. He limped out of the woods, filthy, his fur matted with dried blood. A deep, jagged scar ran across his left eye. The vet said it wouldn't affect his vision, but it left a permanent mark, both on him and on me. War had always been playful, but after that, he changed. He never strayed far from me again, especially near the greenhouse. Whenever I walked down to tend my plants, he was there, pressed against my side, watching the woods with wary eyes. I tried to convince myself it was over, that whatever had happened that night was behind us. But a few weeks later, I saw something that told me otherwise. It was late afternoon, and I was stepping out of the greenhouse, War right beside me, when I noticed movement at the tree line. A shape stood just beyond the trees, barely visible between the thick trunks. I squinted. At first, I thought it was a goat, white with strange curved horns. But there weren't any goats in our area. No one in our sparse neighborhood owned one. Then I blinked, and it was gone. War growled low in his throat, his body tense, ears pinned back. I turned and walked back to the house without looking over my shoulder. Whatever was out there, it wasn't done watching. I was in 6th grade when I first realized ghosts were real. Before that night, I had always been fascinated by the paranormal. Stories about haunted houses, whispered legends of spirits lurking in the dark, but I had never experienced anything myself. Not until the sleepover at Lily's house. Lily lived in a small, rundown house that always felt a little too quiet, a little too still. The kind of house where the floorboards creaked on their own and the wind rattled the windows like something was trying to get inside. Her bedroom was in the basement, tucked at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The basement itself had an eerie vibe, partly because she always kept the lights off in the hallway, letting the darkness stretch endlessly outside her door. The door itself was strange. It didn't have a knob, just an empty hole where one used to be. That meant it was always slightly ajar, leaving her room exposed to whatever might be lurking in the basement. Lily never seemed bothered by it, but I hated that door. Something about the way it stood open to the darkness made me uneasy, like we were being watched. That night, it was me, Lily, and our friend Andy. It was a Friday in December, and outside, the sky was already ink black. We were doing what sixth-grade girls do, blasting music on Lily's old TV, dancing and laughing, completely oblivious to anything outside our little world. At first, it was just a feeling, a sudden nagging sense that something was off. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt the urge to look toward the open doorway. That's when I saw it, a shape, a tall, white silhouette, gliding past the doorway. It was just a blur, but it was unmistakably human-shaped. And the way it moved, it didn't walk, it didn't step, it just drifted past the door like a shadow without a body. My breath caught in my throat, my entire body locking up. Andy must have seen it at the exact same moment because she stepped back too, her hand flying to her mouth. Neither of us screamed, neither of us made a sound, we just stared. The music still blasted from the TV. Lily, who had been looking the other way, hadn't noticed anything yet. But Andy and I, we saw it. We felt it. When we finally managed to speak, our voices were shaky. "Lily," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Did you see that?" She turned, confused. "See what?" Andy and I looked at each other, and I could tell she was just as freaked out as I was. "Someone just walked past your door," Andy said. Lily frowned, but the skepticism in her face was quickly replaced by unease. "Are you messing with me?" "No," I said, my voice hoarse. "I swear, we saw something." Lily's expression changed, and I could tell she was scared. Still, she stepped out into the hallway, hesitating for only a moment before glancing left and right. The basement was silent, empty, and that's when it hit me. The basement door, the stairs. They were always loud, creaky, groaning under even the lightest step. If someone had come downstairs, we would have heard it. And yet the figure we saw passed by without making a sound. Chills ran down my spine. I suddenly felt trapped, like the basement walls were pressing in around us. Andy turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. It was tall," she said. "Really tall." I nodded, swallowing hard. That was exactly what I had seen too. Lily's face paled, her hands gripping the edges of her hoodie sleeves. We didn't sleep much that night. We left the TV on, the volume lower, and kept glancing at the door, half expecting to see that white figure again. But it never came back. Even now, years later, I can still picture it, that pale shape, that impossible silence. And the worst part? I don't think it was passing by the door. I think it was watching us. It started with the wake-ups. At first, I didn't think much of it. Waking up in the middle of the night wasn't unusual, right? Maybe I drank too much water before bed. Maybe my body was restless. But after the third or fourth time, I noticed something. I was always waking up at the exact same time, 3:17 a.m. I was staying at my aunt's house for a couple of weeks. She lived in an old 2-story home with creaky wooden floors, the kind of house where every step echoed in the silence. My room was upstairs at the end of the hallway, with a perfect view of the staircase leading down to the first floor. It was a cozy enough place during the day, but at night, something felt off. The first time I saw him, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I had woken up again, like always, at 3:17 a.m. I rolled over in bed, rubbing my eyes, and for some reason, I felt the urge to look toward the hallway. That's when I saw it. A figure, tall, too tall, standing at the bottom of the staircase, facing up toward me. It was nothing more than a silhouette, but it was solid, darker than the night itself. And the worst part, it was wearing a hat, a wide-brimmed, shadowy thing that made it look even more unnatural. I blinked. It didn't move. I couldn't see its face, but I felt it watching me. I don't know how long I stood there frozen, gripping my blanket with white-knuckled hands. Maybe a few seconds, maybe minutes. But as soon as I worked up the courage to sit up, the figure just wasn't there anymore. I convinced myself it was my imagination, just sleep deprivation. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next night, it happened again. I woke up, 3:17 a.m. My throat was dry, my skin cold. I turned my head toward the staircase. He was there. Closer this time. Still unmoving, still staring. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coat rack, maybe a shadow cast from outside. But there was something wrong about the way he stood, like he didn't belong in this world. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from downstairs. A chill ran down my spine. The house was old, sure, but these weren't the random creaks of a settling foundation. These were actual footsteps, heavy and intentional, moving across the wooden floor beneath me. I wanted to call out for my aunt, but my voice caught in my throat. My body refused to move. I could only stare at the dark figure, knowing it was watching me back. Then, just like before, it was gone. I barely slept that night. The following days, I tried to shake it off. I even mentioned it casually to my aunt, half expecting her to laugh and tell me I was imagining things. Instead, her face darkened. "You saw him too?" she asked quietly. My stomach dropped. She wouldn't say much more, just that things had always been weird in this house, but she had learned to ignore them. "If you don't acknowledge it, it won't bother you," she told me. But I could tell she didn't fully believe that. I tried to ignore it too. I really did. But every night, like clockwork, I woke up. 3:17 a.m. Every night he was there, and every night he got closer. By the end of the week, I could hear his breathing, a slow, heavy sound like wind pushing through an empty tunnel. I never saw him move, but every time I blinked, every time I turned away, he was closer than before. One night, I woke up with my blankets pulled halfway off my bed. The air was ice cold, and when I looked at the staircase, he wasn't at the bottom anymore. He was at the top. I barely had time to react before the house filled with a loud bang, a single deafening noise, like a door slamming shut with impossible force. I shot up in bed, my chest tight, heart hammering in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I just sat there, staring into the dark hallway. He was gone, but I knew he was still there, watching. I left my aunt's house the next morning. I didn't tell her exactly why. I didn't have to. She just nodded like she understood. To this day, I don't know what I saw. Some people say it was the Hat Man, a shadowy figure known to visit people at night. Others say it's just sleep paralysis, a trick of the mind. But I wasn't asleep, and I wasn't paralyzed. And when I look back, the thing that haunts me most isn't that I saw him, it's that he saw me.